Imagine an army of 80,000 men, soldiers, engineers, medics, mule drivers, slaves, moving through hostile territory. No supply lines, no GPS, no radio. And yet, they arrived on time, fed, armed, and ready to fight. Every single time. How? Because Rome didn't just build an army. They built a machine. And the most important part of that machine wasn't the general standing at the front. It was the man standing in the back, counting sacks of grain. This is the story of how Rome quietly replaced battlefield glory with something far more dangerous, obsessive, ruthless, almost inhuman logistics. And why that decision is the reason an Italian city once ruled the entire known world. Let's go back to the beginning. In the early days of Rome, war worked the way it always had. A great commander rode into battle, inspired his men with speeches and personal courage, and if the gods smiled on him, he won. Glory was personal. Victory was intimate. The general was the army. And for a while, that worked. But Rome kept growing. And the bigger Rome got, the more it exposed a terrifying weakness that no amount of personal courage could fix. Feeding an army. Think about what it actually takes to move 80,000 men across 300 miles of foreign land. You need roughly 800 tons of grain per month just to keep them alive. You need 40,000 mules or oxen to carry equipment. You need replacement sandals. Yes, sandals, because a soldier marching 20 miles a day destroys a pair of leather sandals every few weeks. You need iron. You need timber. You need rope. You need medicine. You need water every single day in massive quantities. And if any one of those things runs out, the army doesn't just slow down. It dies. The Carthaginians learned this the hard way. So did the Persians. So did nearly every other military power in the ancient world. Their armies were brilliant in battle and catastrophic on the march. They starved. They got sick. They ran out of arrows or iron or leather and simply stopped working, like a machine without fuel. Rome looked at that pattern and made a choice that would change military history forever. They decided that the most dangerous man on the battlefield wasn't the one with the sword. It was the one with the ledger. The man who embodied this shift more than anyone was Gaius Marius. General, reformer, and arguably the most important soldier in Roman history. Not because of how he fought, but because of how he restructured everything around the fight. Before Marius, the Roman army was an aristocratic institution. Rich men supplied their own equipment. Poor men could barely participate. Supply chains were informal, disorganized, and dependent on whatever a soldier could carry or forage. The army moved with a massive tail of servants, slaves, and wagons that slowed everything down and needed feeding themselves. Marius looked at this system in 107 BC and called it what it was, a disaster waiting to happen. So he standardized everything. Every soldier would now carry the same equipment: a helmet, a larica hamada chainmail shirt, 2 javelins, a gladius, a scutum shield. Same weight, same dimensions, forged to Roman specification, replaceable, interchangeable. And then he did something that shocked the Roman aristocracy. He made every soldier carry his own supplies. Roughly 40 kilograms of gear on each man's back. Tent poles, cooking equipment, 3 days of rations, tools for building camp. The soldiers hated it. They called themselves Marius's mules, Muli Mariani, as a dark, exhausted joke. But Marius understood something they didn't yet. A soldier who carries his own supplies doesn't need 10 slaves to follow him. He doesn't need a wagon. He doesn't create a logistics tail that can be ambushed, raided, or delayed. He is self-contained, mobile, dangerous. The Roman army became lighter, faster, and paradoxically more powerful the moment it accepted being uncomfortable. But carrying 3 days of rations only solves part of the problem, because eventually, those 3 days end. And that's where the real system begins. Behind every Roman army, invisible but absolutely essential, was a network of supply depots called horia. These weren't improvised grain piles. They were permanent stone buildings, strategically positioned across the empire, stocked months in advance by teams of officers whose entire job was calculation. How much grain does a legion of 5,000 men eat in 30 days? The Romans knew the answer to the nearest modius, roughly a peck of grain. They knew how much weight a mule could carry over mountain terrain versus flatland. They knew the caloric difference between barley and wheat, and which soldiers got which based on rank. They tracked spoilage rates. They tracked road conditions. They tracked seasonal availability of local markets. This was not guesswork. This was science. The officer class responsible for this was called the Praefectus Annoni at the imperial level and quaestors and tribunes at the legion level. These men weren't glamorous. They didn't get statues. Their names rarely appear in the histories because history, written by aristocrats, preferred stories of battle. But remove these men from the Roman system, and the entire thing collapses in weeks. Consider what they managed during a single campaign season. Before an army moved, supply officers would travel ahead, sometimes months ahead, to survey roads, identify water sources, negotiate with local merchants, requisition grain from subject territories, and calculate the precise timing of resupply convoys. They built bridges before the army needed them. They stockpiled timber at river crossings. They identified winter quarters before autumn ended. When Julius Caesar was preparing his Gallic campaigns, his supply officers were already in motion before a single legionary had laced up his sandals. The army didn't chase logistics. Logistics led the army. And then there was the camp. Every single night, in hostile territory, the Roman legion built a fort. Not a suggestion of a fort, not a ring of shields. A full fortified camp, castra, with ditches, ramparts, watchtowers, organized streets, designated latrines, a medical area, a command tent positioned at the exact same location every time, and gates aligned with the 4 cardinal directions. This took roughly 3 hours at the end of a 20-mile march. While half the army stood guard, the other half dug. They used standardized tools. Each man knew exactly what to carry and exactly what to build. The dimensions of a Roman camp were fixed. The layout was identical whether you were in Gaul, Britannia, Judea, or Egypt. A soldier who transferred from one legion to another could walk into any Roman camp and know exactly where the granary was, where the hospital was, where his unit was sleeping. This wasn't comfort. This was psychology. Familiarity under stress reduces panic. A soldier who knows where everything is doesn't freeze. He moves. He reacts. And when the alarm sounds at 2 in the morning, which it occasionally did, every man knew exactly what to do and exactly where to go without being told. The camp was a machine for producing calm and chaos, and it required enormous logistical discipline to maintain. Every morning, the camp was disassembled. Before an army moved, supply officers would travel ahead, sometimes months ahead, to survey roads, identify water sources, negotiate with local merchants, requisition grain from subject territories, and calculate the precise timing of resupply convoys. They built bridges before the army needed them. They stockpiled timber at river crossings. They identified winter quarters before autumn ended. When Julius Caesar was preparing his Gallic campaigns, his supply officers were already in motion before a single legionary had laced up his sandals. The army didn't chase logistics. Logistics led the army. And then there was the camp. Every single night, in hostile territory, the Roman legion built a fort. Not a suggestion of a fort, not a ring of shields. A full fortified camp, castra, with ditches, ramparts, watchtowers, organized streets, designated latrines, a medical area, a command tent positioned at the exact same location every time, and gates aligned with the 4 cardinal directions. This took roughly 3 hours at the end of a 20-mile march. While half the army stood guard, the other half dug. They used standardized tools. Each man knew exactly what to carry and exactly what to build. The dimensions of a Roman camp were fixed. The layout was identical whether you were in Gaul, Britannia, Judea, or Egypt. A soldier who transferred from one legion to another could walk into any Roman camp and know exactly where the granary was, where the hospital was, where his unit was sleeping. This wasn't comfort. This was psychology. Familiarity under stress reduces panic. A soldier who knows where everything is doesn't freeze. He moves. He reacts. And when the alarm sounds at 2 in the morning, which it occasionally did, every man knew exactly what to do and exactly where to go without being told. The camp was a machine for producing calm and chaos, and it required enormous logistical discipline to maintain. Every morning, the camp was disassembled. Who might make a brilliant decision or a terrible one? He was placing his life in the hands of a system that had been tested and refined over centuries. That distinction mattered more than any speech, because when the system failed, people died, not in combat, in slow, humiliating, preventable ways. The failed Roman campaign in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, where 3 entire legions were annihilated, was partly a logistics catastrophe. General Varus had been lulled into moving through unfamiliar territory without proper reconnaissance or supply preparation. The columns stretched for miles through dense forest, encumbered by wagons and civilians. They couldn't build their camp. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't fight the way they had been trained to fight because the logistical framework that made them lethal had been stripped away. 18,000 Roman soldiers died in 3 days. Augustus Caesar reportedly wandered the halls of his palace for months afterward, shouting, "Varus, give me back my legions." It is one of the most famous expressions of grief in Roman history. But the lesson Rome drew wasn't about the enemy. It was about the system. Varus had trusted individual judgment over institutional process. He had improvised. He had assumed. And the machine, deprived of its structure, had broken apart in the trees of Germania. The response wasn't to find a better general. It was to build better protocols, better reconnaissance requirements, better rules for when and where an army could move. The Roman answer to catastrophe was almost always the same: more system, more structure, more standardization. Compare this with how other ancient armies operated. The Persian Empire, at its height, could field armies that dwarfed anything Rome produced. Herodotus, admittedly exaggerating, described Xerxes crossing into Greece with over 1 million men. Even if the real number was a fraction of that, it was still massive. But Persian logistics were built around abundance, not efficiency. They moved with enormous supply trains, relied on local foraging, and when supply lines broke or territory turned hostile, the army became vulnerable almost immediately. Alexander the Great was a military genius of almost supernatural ability. He understood logistics better than most commanders of his era. He deliberately kept his baggage train lean, moved fast, and used speed to compensate for supply uncertainty. But Alexander's system was built around Alexander. It required his personal decisions, his personal energy, his personal presence. When Alexander died at 32, his empire fractured almost immediately because there was no system that could outlive the man. Rome's system could outlive any man. That was the point. When a Roman general died mid-campaign, his quaestors still knew where the grain was. His tribunes still knew the marching schedule. The camp would still be built tonight at the correct dimensions. The supply convoy would still arrive on schedule. The machine did not require a genius to operate. It required disciplined, trained, interchangeable professionals doing their jobs. That is an almost shockingly modern idea for an empire that collapsed 1,500 years ago. Medieval European armies, for context, were still largely operating on the pre-Marian model: great lords, personal retinues, irregular supplies, and the catastrophic logistical reality that most armies of the 12th and 13th centuries couldn't stay in the field for more than 6 weeks before starvation forced retreat. The Crusades failed repeatedly not because of enemy strength, but because European armies couldn't solve the supply problem that Rome had cracked 1,000 years earlier. Napoleon famously said that an army marches on its stomach. He was right, but he said it in the 19th century. Rome had been living it since the 2nd century BC. So here is the answer to the question we started with. Rome didn't replace its elite commanders with logistics officers out of weakness or bureaucratic decay. It did it out of ruthless, clear-eyed intelligence. It looked at the history of military power across the ancient world and identified the single, most reliable variable in determining whether an army succeeded or failed. Not the genius of the general, not the courage of the soldiers, not the quality of the weapons. The system. A brilliant general with poor logistics loses. A mediocre general with excellent logistics wins. Not always. Not in every single battle. But across a campaign, across a decade, across a century, the system wins. Every time. Rome built an empire not because its soldiers were braver than everyone else's, though many were brave. Not because its generals were smarter than everyone else's, though some were brilliant. But because Rome, almost uniquely in the ancient world, understood that the foundation of military power is administrative. It is unglamorous. It is grain and nails and leather and water and roads and record-keeping. It is the man with the ledger. The Roman army was, at its peak, the closest thing the ancient world produced to a modern professional military institution. standardized equipment, professional officers, permanent fortifications, managed supply chains, medical services, engineering corps, retirement benefits, pensions. It looked less like an ancient army and more like a corporation. A corporation whose product was the controlled application of violence, optimized over centuries of iteration and failure. And when Rome stopped investing in that system, when the late empire began relying on federated barbarian troops who didn't share the institutional culture, when the administrative capacity decayed, when the roads stopped being repaired and the supply depots weren't restocked, the army didn't suddenly lose its courage. It lost its nervous system. And an army without a nervous system is just a crowd with weapons. The fall of Rome was, in many ways, a logistics failure, which is perhaps the most Roman ending imaginable. Here's what I want you to think about. We celebrate the generals. We name our children after conquerors. We build statues of men on horseback. But the Roman Empire, the roads you've heard about, the aqueducts, the centuries of relative stability, was largely built and maintained by men whose names we've lost. Accountants, surveyors, quartermasters, the people who counted the grain. So the question is this: in your own life, in your own work, are you focusing on the dramatic moments, the big speech, the bold decision, the heroic gesture, or are you building the system that makes success inevitable regardless of who's standing at the front? Because Rome didn't conquer the world in a day. It conquered it one perfectly supplied camp at a time. If you found this fascinating, you're going to want to watch what happens next, because we haven't talked about the Roman Medical Corps yet. An army that invented battlefield triage, field surgery, and quarantine protocols 2,000 years before modern medicine. The story of how Rome kept its soldiers alive long enough to fight. That one will genuinely surprise you.